My name is Jessie Daniels, and I'm a professor of sociology here at Hunter College and at the Graduate Center of CUNY. Um, I've been doing research on white supremacists for over 25 years now, so a long time.
Was it purely academic, or was there something else in you that kind of gravitated towards that?
Yeah. Initially it was really a purely academic exercise for me. I have to say that during the process, though, of my graduate school career, that it became a much more personal project for me. And it's not something I've talked about much, but there are two things that happened. One, I worked on a project with Professor Joe Fagan on a book called Living with Racism, which was interviews with middle-class African Americans and their experiences of discrimination. And my job as a research assistant to Dr. Fagan was transcribing those interviews. And as I began that project, I think I was really like most white liberals. I thought racism was a thing of the past. I thought discrimination was, that claims of discrimination were overblown, were exaggerated, weren't really grounded in reality. And very quickly in the process of transcribing those interviews, I began to recognize a pattern and to see that discrimination and racism are systemic and that it was an ongoing and an urgent problem. So that was the first thing. The second thing that happened to me in my graduate school career was quite unexpected. This was after I'd already started this dissertation research on white supremacists, and I visited my great aunt, who is my grandfather's sister, and I pulled a book off the shelf and asked her why she had this book. It was a copy of Thomas Dixon's *The Klansman*, which was the book that was that D.W. Griffith used for *Birth of a Nation*. And I noticed that my grandfather's signature was in the flyleaf of the book, and I asked her, "Aunt Marie, why do you have this book, and why does it have my grandfather's name in it?" And she said, "Oh, honey, he was in that group." So I didn't realize until this moment that my own grandfather had been part of the Klan. Now, I shouldn't have been surprised, because there are millions and millions of Americans who were in the Klan during the 1920s, which is about the time my grandfather would have been in it. But it came as an utter shock to me.
In your view, what's the danger of extremists having their message kind of appear in a more mainstream forum?
So communication scholars talk about this as the Overton window. It's sort of the range of acceptable political discourse. And what you see happening with people like David Duke and others is that they keep sort of nudging the mainstream politicians to take up their language, to take up their framing of issues, to take up their agenda. And every time a mainstream politician does that, the Overton window, that is the sort of frame of what's acceptable to debate and to discuss, gets moved a little bit more.
I mean, what's the worst fears that you have, and maybe potential for violence?
There's a lot of potential for violence with white supremacists, and Timothy McVeigh and the terrorism that he enacted in Oklahoma City, was drawn directly from the Turner Diaries. And Anders Breivik in Norway had spent time on Stormfront and other white nationalist websites. So I think the connection between sort of white supremacist extremist rhetoric and discourse, whether it's in print form like the Turner Diaries or it's online at Stormfront, are clear indications that there's a connection between white supremacist rhetoric and white supremacist violence.
Can you talk about some of the incidents of violence that you've seen through the years, and what has your experience of them been?
So when these acts of violence happen, there's a kind of nauseous understanding that I have of what's unfolding that isn't widely shared. So for example, when the events in Oklahoma City were unfolding, the first news reports that we got were that it was a Middle Eastern man. And I knew right away that because it was a federal building, and because it was in the middle of the country, I just really had this sense that it wasn't somebody from the Middle East, and it wasn't a kind of Middle East terrorism, that this was homegrown terrorism, that this was likely a white supremacist, and that they had likely targeted this federal building because they see the federal government as part of what they call the Zionist occupied government, that it's run by Jewish people and is the enemy of white people, right? There's a little bit of feeling of kind of a helpless rage at that, just sort of seeing the wrongness of this interpretation for current events going on. And also, the kind of helplessness at not being able to stop it, to understanding, white supremacist violence and not being able to stop it when it's happening.